we've gone through the feast with the idea that all the feasts point to Christ. And so we started out with the Passover, which points to the death of Christ. Then the Feast of Unleavened Bread points to the sinlessness of his sacrifice. Then we have first fruits, which points to his resurrection. So on the Passover, you have Passover on Friday, Sabbath, first fruits, unleavened bread, boom, boom, boom. Then we have the Shavuot, or the Pentecost, which points to the birth of the church. And then there's a 3-month interval in Leviticus 22. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and for the foreigner residing among you. I am the Lord. So that pictures this church age, the age of grace, a 3-month parenthesis there, pausing in the feasts. And then we come to Rosh Hashanah, which will be fulfilled by the rapture of the church. Rosh Hashanah is the start of the fall feasts, the Jewish New Year. Happy New Year, Happy New Year, Rosh Hashanah, Rosh Hashanah. And then 10 days later, we have Yom Kippur. So it's the most holy day in the Jewish biblical calendar, and salvation for all those who will follow God's plan of atonement. So let's look first at the biblical practice and just look at Leviticus. So we're going to look at Leviticus 23:26. Day of Atonement. The Lord said to Moses, "The 10th day of the 7th month is the Day of Atonement. Hold a sacred assembly and deny yourselves and present a food offering to the Lord. Do not do any work on that day, because it is the Day of Atonement, when the atonement is made for you before the Lord your God. Those who do not deny themselves on that day must be cut off from the people. I will destroy from among the people anyone who does any work on that day. You shall do no work at all. This is to be a lasting ordinance for generations to come wherever you live. It is a day of Sabbath rest for you, and you must deny yourselves. From evening of the 9th day of the month until the following evening, you are to observe your Sabbath." So it was both a national Day of Atonement and an individual Day of Atonement. So you have Rosh Hashanah, and then you have 8 days, and then you have Yom Kippur. So for those 8 days then, the Jews were looking at their personal life and trying to figure out ways how they could become more holy, more closer to God. But then on Yom Kippur itself, you have the national atonement, and you have the 2 goats. You have the sin goat and the scapegoat, Azazel, the scapegoat. It's important to know that the sin goat was slaughtered first, because blood had to be shed before their sins could be sent away by the scapegoat out into the desert. So the high priest had to atone for his own sin before going in, even before the sin goat was slaughtered. So a bull. So he slaughtered a bull, was ready to go into the most holy place, slit the throat of the sin goat in a bowl, cut it in a bowl, took it into the most holy place, and the Shekinah glory, the very presence of God, would fill that up, and he would sprinkle that blood on the mercy seat. When he went into the most holy place, they wore like a probably very ornate rope around his ankle when he went in, because if he went in any kind of known sin, then he would be struck dead in the presence of God. And so if he was struck dead, then they couldn't go in to get him, so they would pull him out with this rope. No record. I don't know if there's any record of that happening, but they took that precaution. They were aware. The high priest was more than aware that he had to go in, obviously not sinless, but not in any ongoing known sin. Now, even for those individually, it only the atonement would only be effective for those of faith. Sin was forgiven in the Old Testament exactly how sin is forgiven in the New Testament, is by faith. So when not on the Day of Atonement, but any other day, when a Jew felt the burden of sin and wanted to atone for that sin, and took an animal, took a sacrifice to either the tabernacle or the temple, it was by faith. So the person would cut the throat of the animal, give it to the priest would take it and put it on the bronze altar, and God said when the smoke went up from it, it would be like a sweet smelling incense to him. If the person had faith that sacrifice, that God would accept that sacrifice by faith. So it's just like going to church. There's people that go through the motions. They go to church and they're just going through the motions. I said, okay, I'm supposed to go to church. So I show up, I sit, I hear, I get up, and I go home. They have no faith, they're just going through the motions. Just because you sit in the garage doesn't mean you're a car. And it's the same with those Jews. That some of those Jews that brought sacrifices, they did what Moses told them to do. They brought sacrifices, but they were just going through the motions. Meant nothing. They said, okay, I'm supposed to bring this animal, take it to the priest, let's put it on the bronze altar, I'm good. Well, that wasn't the deal at all, because the atonement would only temporarily cover that sin by faith, just like the Levitical system. The high priest would, talking about the different kinds of sins, we can look at David, and in Psalm 51. Look at Psalm 51. David when the prophet Nathan came to David after committing adultery with Bathsheba, have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love, according to your great compassion. And he mentions three things. He says, first of all, blot out my transgressions. That's one kind of sin. And a transgression is a choosing to sin. It's not, oops, I sinned. It's you have enough time to know this is a choice. Like David did. David had enough time. But he chose to sin. And for the transgression, you have the burnt offering in Psalm 32:1. But the first one, he said, is block out my transgressions. Secondly, he says, wash away all my iniquity. Now, iniquity is a little different in that it's continuing after you choose to sin. You don't stop. David could have just chosen to sin against Bathsheba and just stop. But he didn't stop. He continued in his sin by killing Uriah. So the second one is iniquity means continuing to knowingly sin. And that is seen in Micah 2:1, which is you can offer a guilt offering. And then the third one is, and cleanse me from my sin. And this merely means to miss the mark. And you would offer a sin offering. But those are the types of sins that were cleansed on the Day of Atonement. Now, in the dispensation of Torah, there was only one mediator, and that mediator was the high priest. There's only one guy once a year in the Holy of Holies. But now in the dispensation of grace, because Christ is our mediator, and we have access to him in the Holy of Holies, he is now our mediator. Christ is our mediator. It took the spilling of blood on that's why Yom Kippur is important, because the blood had to be shed. Blood had to be shed here with the two goats, and blood had to be shed in a regular sacrifice other than Yom Kippur. But obviously, blood had to be shed on the cross for our atonement. But in 70 AD, all that changed. When the Romans came in and destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed the temple, there were no Sadducees anymore. There was no temple, there were no Sadducees. Jews were dispersed throughout the world, but so the biblical practice kind of ended in 70 AD. Now, today, the Jewish observance, actually the Jewish observance, so if there's no temple, then how do they observe it? Well, they try to, do it on their own, basically. They want to try to, an inner life that's more pleasing to God. Secular Jews do nothing. There are Jews in the Goodlettsville, White House, Gallatin, Henderson area. There are over 1,000 homes that have identified themselves as being Jewish. At least one person in that home is identified as being Jewish, just in this area, okay? I'm sure a lot of them, if not the vast majority of them, are secular. And so they do nothing. Yom Kippur comes, so they don't, they don't observe it, they don't do anything. Now, religious Jews practice teshuvah, or turning back, or repenting. But the problem is, ultimately, they think they can achieve atonement on their own. And they have substituted affliction of the body, which is like some of them, they fast, they won't bathe, they won't wear earrings, they won't wear lipstick, they won't wear any luxury items in a sense of trying to, deny themselves. But they have three substitutions. This is what they have substituted for the shedding of blood: confession of sin, prayer, and good works. Confession of sin, prayer, and good works. So basically, the Orthodox, for example, so a religious Jew would go out and try to do some good works. Maybe work at a homeless shelter, or homeless kitchen, or repentance, confession of sin, prayer, and some good works. And of course, we know the good works will not atone for our sins. Orthodox Jews use a chicken, and they take this chicken and they hold it above their heads and they say, "This is my substitute. This is my exchange. This is my atonement. This fowl will go to its death, and I shall enter a good and long life of peace.
Is that the picture that you were looking for?
Yeah.
I don't know that I have it. I had tabernacles.
So, obviously, that doesn't atone for anything. Because why? Because there has to be the shedding of blood. Now, today, does anybody know, in Jerusalem today, there's a group that are training rabbis. Now, I forget it, quite honestly, I forget why this is the case, but in San Diego with Rabbi Barney Castan, I guess genetically, and I don't understand this because I'm not a scientist, genetically they can determine who is a Cohen, who is a priest, through DNA. And so they have in Israel, they are training priests for a new tabernacle, a new temple. And they are making, they are making the implements, 7-branch candlestick, altar of incense, table of showbread. They're making all this stuff in anticipation of the temple. Now, I don't, the political situation is so volatile there. I don't see how anybody, because when the Muslims controlled part of Jerusalem, they built the Dome of the Rock right over the place where the Holy of Holies and the temple was supposed to be. So, you read all these things about how, well, they've discovered that part of it can be over here and they can build part of the temple. But I'm sure if the Jews tried to start to build any kind of a temple, that the Muslims would go crazy over there. So, but, and the red heifer thing, periodically you hear, oh, red heifer has been born, to show that Messiah's coming back, and then nothing happens, and they say, well, we found, three gray hairs on the heifer, so it really wasn't. So it really wasn't the real red heifer. But it's sad to say that that's what the Jews have. Instead of just saying, the blood of Christ is sufficient, and there needs to be bloodshed, they have substituted, just like they substituted the oral law for the Torah, just like that. When they could not uphold and follow the 613 commandments in Torah, they pulled God's high holy standard down into the mud and came up with things they could do, which is the oral law. So kind of like that, instead of, when the temple was gone, instead of saying, well, there needs to be blood. We know that there needs to be a blood sacrifice. So instead of accepting Christ's blood sacrifice, the vast majority of Jews in the world choose either to do nothing, to do some good works, or if you're Orthodox, the chicken thing. As a matter of fact, I don't know if you're familiar with PETA. You know what PETA is? Mm-hmm. People for the ethical treatment of animals. They're filing lawsuits in New York against the Orthodox Jews, saying it's a holocaust of chickens. Because all these Orthodox are killing chicken, So, so that is the Jewish perspective.